Good morning, everyone. This is Rebecca Strauss with Miller Johnson. I have with me this morning my friend and partner, Keith Eastland. We are here this morning to talk about Fair Labor Standards Act and labor issues that are popping up in this COVID-19 world. We thank you for starting your morning with us. Before we get started on labor law and the Fair Labor Standards Act, we'd like to let you know the latest news. The vital statistics are not great, but there is a flattening starting to occur in the U.S. and in Michigan. Globally, now more than 2 million people are infected with COVID-19, and there have been 134,000 deaths. In the U.S., we're up to 636,000 infected and 28,000 deaths. And here in Michigan, we're a little over 28,000 confirmed cases with a little over 1,900 total deaths. Yesterday here in Michigan, there was a protest entitled Operation Gridlock. It brought thousands and thousands of protesters to the state capitol to express displeasure over Governor Whitmer's stay-at-home order. She followed up with a press conference later that day, doubling down on the stay-at-home order. Yesterday, Governor Whitmer issued another executive order, Executive Order 50, 2020-50, which enhances protections for residents and staff of long-term care facilities. Also yesterday, the Pennsylvania State Senate voted to override their governor's stay-at-home order. So that's an indication that state legislators are starting to get involved in challenging the authority of their governors. In small business loan news, yesterday the SBA announced that as of 9 p.m., there have been more than $324 billion, that's B with a billion, $324 billion approved in loan applications, projecting the $349 billion program will be exhausted sometime today. Also, President Trump said the White House is going to release guidelines today on how to start relaxing social distancing. As you may have heard, there's been tension between the president and the governors about who has the authority to relax social distancing. Laws and executive orders have been issued by the governors. So stay tuned on that, but we will be hearing more from President Trump in the White House today. Okay, so that is the news. Now let's get into the substance of this morning's webinar. First of all, just like to introduce ourselves. This is me. This is a live shot of me and my kids this morning, so hopefully you won't be hearing them. For the rest of you working from home, I have a feeling you may have a similar situation. And this is my friend and partner, Keith. Say hi, Keith. Oh, you're waving to us. Great. All right, so this is us working from home, just like the rest of you. Feeling the discomfort of that and getting used to our new normal, as all of you are too. Let's talk about the Fair Labor Standards Act because some things change and some things stay the same, right, even in a COVID-19 world. Fair Labor Standards Act, I love it. Some of you don't. But let's jump in and answer all your questions that you have today. The topics I'm going to cover before getting to your questions are talking about salary and wage reductions, what is permitted, what is not, and how to go about doing it. Teleworking for non-exempt employees, what does that mean? How do we keep track of hours, and what does the Department of Labor have to say about that right now? Providing extra pay for employees who continue to come to work. We've had a number of questions about that, and there may be some legislation at the state or federal level involving that as well, and then of course we will answer your questions. So let's talk first about salary and wage reductions. These are the questions that we've been getting from all of you, so we thought we would share those questions and answers with the group so that everyone can benefit. First, let's talk about exempt employees. I'm not going to go through a whole webinar on teaching you about the salary basis for exempt employees. I'm going to assume we all have that. We're starting from the same point, understanding that employees to be exempt must get paid a minimum salary that meets the statutory minimum, and it's the same amount every week without reduction because of quality or quantity of work, okay? So now, with that in mind, can I reduce the salary of an exempt employee? This is assuming, of course, you have financial constraints right now, and the C-suite is asking for ways to save money anywhere we can. So can you cut down the salary of an exempt employee? First of all, the answer is a qualified yes, all right, a hesitant yes. Yes, but the salary still has to meet the statutory minimum of about $680 a week, and it cannot be short-term. It cannot be reduced on a day-to-day basis or even a week-to-week basis. The DOL has said that it can be reduced to meet a long-term business need. Long-term, that phrase long-term is not defined. It's been suggested that a few months is probably fine, but not a week or two. So if you're thinking of doing that today, just until the end of April, because you assume that things are going to get back to normal as of May 1st, I would not recommend that. If you're looking at reducing exempt salaries for a longer period of time, right, 3 months-ish, something like that, then you're probably okay. All right, next question. Can I reclassify an exempt employee as a non-exempt employee during this time period? Yes, you can, but, and it's the same but as the question above. It should not be for day-to-day or week-to-week needs. If it's for a long-term business need, then my answer would be yes. This can be helpful, for instance, if you still need someone's services or want to keep them employed, but you really just don't need them 40 hours a week anymore. Maybe you only need them 20 hours a week or even less. The problem with that is sometimes, depending on what their salary was, half of that salary might bring them below the minimum salary amount, and that minimum salary amount is not prorated for part-time employees, okay? So that can be one reason why you might want to switch exempt to non-exempt. Also, again, you might just need them for a few hours a week, maybe as little as 5 or 10 hours a week these days, in which case you can save a lot of money by just paying them for the hours they work and not paying them for a whole week, because as all of you on this call know, I'm sure, if an exempt employee works any part of 1 week, they have to get paid the full week. But non-exempt employees, not true, right? Non-exempt employees just get paid for the time they actually work. So that can be another tool in your toolbox, but keep in mind it should be for a longer-term business need and not just for the next couple of weeks. The next question is an interesting concept that the DOL has answered directly for us. Can a salaried exempt employee volunteer to take a partial week off due to lack of work and then not get paid for the full week? Okay, remember what I just said. When an exempt employee works any part of a week, they get paid for the full week. But what if they say, look, I know the business is having trouble right now. I'll volunteer to only work 4 days a week, and you can just pay me for 4 days and not that 5th day. The Department of Labor, interestingly, has said that is okay if it's truly voluntary. They did say that an employer can ask for volunteers, okay, so this does not have to be a spontaneous thought in your employee's mind. So an employer can say, look, we're facing a real crunch here. We may have to lay off some employees. We may have to make some difficult decisions. If anyone would like to volunteer, right, to any of our exempt employees to work less and get paid less each week, let us know. They can volunteer to do that. That does not have to be on a long-term basis. Okay, so that's not a real change to the salary. They're just their salary stays the same, but they're just not getting paid their full salary for the weeks they volunteer to take off some days. Okay, let's talk about non-exempt employees for a moment. Is it legal for an employer to reduce the wages or number of hours of an hourly employee? Yes. Okay, that is always okay, assuming there's no contract at issue. Okay, so those are ways the things you have to think about before reducing the pay of exempt and non-exempt workers. Let's talk now about working from home. Okay, so working from home is fraught with Fair Labor Standards Act danger, right? So that's why we have this. I don't always work from home, but when I do, I lay the groundwork for a Fair Labor Standards Act lawsuit. What are the issues for non-exempt employees working from home? Exempt employees, I don't have any burning questions, but feel free to, in the question and answer function in the webinar, if you have questions about exempt employees working from home, feel free to ask. I'm going to focus on non-exempt employees. The general rules for non-exempt employees working from home are the same as if they're working at your facility, right? So people are paid for all the time they work, and they're not paid for time they don't work. There is one new regulation on this that just came up that I'm going to mention in just a moment. But generally, right, we pay for all work time, even if it's not productive work time, meetings, those sorts of things. Methods for timekeeping can be tricky when folks are working from home, and I should say that aren't used to working from home, okay? Some organizations have non-exempt employees that are working from home, but that's always been where they've worked from, so the timekeeping methods have been worked out over the years. So I'm really focusing now on folks that you're not used to having work from home. Obviously, there's no time clock on the wall of their house when they come in and out. So how are you managing this? There are online clocks, time clocks. Our assistants use those, for instance, so they can clock in, clock out, so to speak, on the computer when they get on the computer or not. They can simply write down or email you the hours they work every day. An actual clock, whether it's on a computer or a clock on the wall, is not actually required by the Fair Labor Standards Act. Many, many employers prefer a clock because it takes a lot of the guesswork out of it, and frankly, it provides excellent evidence, not foolproof evidence, but excellent evidence as to when someone may be working and may not be working. But you can, in these circumstances, if you don't have a system like that set up, it is okay under the Fair Labor Standards Act just to have someone tell you their hours. I would not have that be verbal, though. I would have them either write it down and scan and send it to you, or mail it into you, or email you their hours that day or maybe that week, right? I wouldn't let it go more than 1 week because, as you know, the Fair Labor Standards Act keeps track of time on a weekly basis. There is one other method that many employers don't use, but it's explicitly provided for in the regulations, called the exception method. So the exception method works like this. You and the employee agree that the employee will work 40 hours a week. Pick your number of hours, by the way. It doesn't have to be 40. That's just an example. In my example, you and the employee agree that the employee will work 40 hours a week. You also agree that you as the employer will assume that the employee is actually working 40 hours a week, no more, no less, unless the employee tells you of an exception. In that situation, you'd run payroll at paying them 40 hours a week, unless the employee has told you, in the manner you tell them to tell you, that they worked more or less than that. So for instance, you could say, if you work more or less than 40 hours, please send me an email on that day letting me know, and we will adjust your pay accordingly. And then if they do tell you, you have to adjust their pay, right? Unless you think there's some fraud or dishonesty going on and you investigate that. That is called the exception method, which again is perfectly legal under the Fair Labor Standards Act. All right, now let's talk about a new Fair Labor Standards Act rule, which is kind of exciting because we don't get those very much. But in the FFCRA, the regulations, okay, not the actual law, but the regulations. This is the law that created the paid leave entitlements for employees who work for companies that have 500 or less employees, or for businesses that have 500 or less employees. Excuse me, I'm getting tongue-tied this morning. There are now new paid leave entitlements, right? That's what the FFCRA does. So for the businesses on the phone that are larger businesses, you probably haven't paid a lot of attention to the FFCRA. Our smaller businesses have paid a lot of attention to the FFCRA. The regulations implementing the FFCRA talk about the definition of teleworking from home, and the regulations specifically abrogate Fair Labor Standards Act regulation, okay? And I'm just gonna read you the regulation real quick, a portion of it. It's very short, I promise, and I'm gonna tell you what it means. All right, in the FFCRA regulations, the Department of Labor says, employees who are teleworking for COVID-19 related reasons must be compensated for all hours actually worked and which the employer knew or should have known were worked by the employee. However, the provisions of Section 790.6 of this chapter shall not apply to employees while they are teleworking for COVID-19 related reasons. So what is Section 790.6? Okay, look to your left or your right, or wherever you have your book of your Fair Labor Standards Act regulations. I know you brought them home with you from the office like I did, and flip to that section, and you will see that is the regulation that talks about all in a day's work. So usually under this regulation, employees start getting paid from when they first start working, and they stop getting paid when they stop working at the end of the day, except for one 30-minute meal period, 20 to 30-minute meal period, should you choose to give that to them, okay? And everything else is all in a day's work, meaning they get paid for all of that time, whether they're up or down a little bit during the day, okay? Are you with me? So for employees that travel, for instance, they don't get paid normal commute time to their first stop. They start working at that first stop if they're in home health care, for instance, right, the first client or patient's home, and then they continue to get paid until they stop working at the last stop or the last patient's home in that example, right? And the rest is all in a day's work except for one meal period. What the Department of Labor has said in this case is, and they go on in another section of the regulations about this, employees who are teleworking for COVID-19 reasons can work in chunks, in discrete chunks throughout the day and evening, by the way. And this is mostly to accommodate caring for children who may be home, so that your employees who have young children at home and require attention, as sometimes children do, they might keep demanding to be fed every day. I can't understand why. But they said that you should allow employees to work, for instance, from 8 to 10, and then maybe from 12 to 2, and then maybe from 4 to 5, and then maybe from 8 to 10 in the evening when the kids are asleep, right? Maybe we can shift some of the work to the times when the kids don't need our attention. So for your non-exempt employees who are teleworking for COVID-19 reasons, there is actually a change to the Fair Labor Standards Act, and the all in a day's work principle does not apply. They can work in chunks. See my point above about methods for timekeeping in that situation. All of those would still apply. Okay, now let's talk about extra pay. We started this with talking about how to cut pay, how to reduce pay to meet your budgetary needs. Now let's talk about extra pay, because we do have clients who are in essential businesses, right, who need their employees coming to work desperately. And it's not the subject of this webinar, but as you know, there's very generous unemployment benefits, as well as, some people are just very scared to come to work. So there are important motivations that are causing employees to be hesitant or not want to come to work. So how do we encourage folks to keep coming? There's a few concepts here, but sometimes you have to include the extra pay into the overtime rate. Okay, so let's talk about that for just a moment. And hopefully most of this is reviewed, because this is not COVID-19 specific. These are not COVID-19 specific rules. But as a refresher, because we've been getting these questions from clients, I want to talk to you about bonuses, gifts, and a percentage of total pay. So bonuses that are non-discretionary must be included in the regular rate for calculating overtime. Non-discretionary bonuses, in a nutshell, are the types of bonuses that you tell employees they're going to get if they do something. If you don't have any absences in the next 2 weeks, you'll get a bonus of $200, right? If you meet a certain production goal, you'll get a bonus of this. And then the employee does it, then you give them the bonus. That's non-discretionary, and that has to be included in the regular rate. A discretionary bonus is much like a gift, which is the next bullet point there. Those are completely discretionary. You have not promised them or implied that if the employee does something, they will get it. And it's usually not even mentioned much before the time you actually give it. And one way to think about it is it's usually looking backwards, right? Here's an extra $200 because we really appreciate the hard work you've put in over the past 2 weeks. Christmas gifts are often in this category, right? That sort of thing. Those do not have to be included in the regular rate. So if you're going to do something along these lines, consider making it a gift or a discretionary bonus, which means that you're not using it to incentivize certain behavior. As soon as you do that, as soon as you promise it ahead of time for behavior to incentivize it, you're making it non-discretionary, okay? But look at the third bullet there, percentage of total pay as bonus. If you structure a bonus to say it's a percentage of the total pay, including their overtime, so whatever your pay was going to be for this week, regular rate and overtime, add it all up, whatever that is, we're going to give you a 10% bonus on top of that. We're going to take 10% of that total payroll check and give that to you as extra, as a reward for coming to work every day and for, doing this important work to feed our community or take care of the healthcare needs of our community or whatever your folks are doing. Then you're good. No additional calculation is needed. I am not a math major, but I have a few partners who are, and they understand this very well. Basically, if you do the math, because you're giving them a percentage on top of what they're already getting for overtime, you've satisfied your overtime requirements. Okay, so that is a mathematically easier way to give people a bonus, promise it ahead of time, but then not have to go through a very painful recalculation of the regular rate and overtime. All right, let's talk for just a moment about, I'm calling them government-funded bonuses. Some people are talking about hazard pay. There's proposals in the state of Michigan, as well as the federal government, talking about giving extra hazard pay to frontline workers. It's a little murky exactly who would be included in this. Almost certainly hospital employees working with COVID-19 patients. Those are the most obvious, right? How much broader that category is going to get, I frankly cannot tell you, because all of this is being discussed and debated right now. The way that I've seen these proposals described, it would be a payment by the government to these employees, but through the employer. So the question then is, well, how does an employer deal with that then, right? Does that impact the overtime rate, for instance? To be honest with you, I am not sure, because in my career, I've never seen anything like this happen, and probably none of you have either. I am hoping and praying that if a government entity does pass something like this, they will give us guidance, right? Real specifics and nuts and bolts on how to implement this and how it impacts overtime rate and other things. I can't go into too much more detail because the definitions and the amounts, it's all being debated as we speak, but that is that could be on the horizon. Let's talk about exempt employees for just a moment. That one's easy. That one's super easy. I love when you guys call with this question. Can I give my exempt employee a bonus above and beyond the guaranteed salary that I promised them? The answer is always yes. It's always yes. And it can be a flat amount. It can be a certain amount based on how many extra hours they happen to work in a week. It can be basically whatever you want it to be, okay? Now, before I turn things over to Keith, I see we've got some questions in, so let me see which of those I can answer for you. I have one question, where is the exception method in the FLSA, I do have my book next to me, but I don't want to take the time to flip through it. I can get you, I see the name of the person who sent that. I can get you that site to the exception method in the regs after the webinar. Another question, where's the DOL guidance or opinion letter that an exempt employee can volunteer? I can send that to you too. In fact, I have it on my other screen that I'm not sharing with you, but I will get that to you because it is a surprising opinion by the DOL. I agree with that. How do you maintain the outside sales exemption during COVID-19? That is a very difficult question. In my opinion, an outside salesperson would not meet the definition of an outside salesperson during this time, assuming that person is not actually going to customer sites and selling right now. And I'm assuming that's the case, which is why you're asking the question. So under a strict reading of the Fair Labor Standards Act, they would lose their exemption for this period, but just this period. And then once this passes and they're back to in-person sales, they would go back to that exemption. I'm hoping the Department of Labor, by the way, will issue some guidance on some of these questions. They've been, I think, working very hard on the FLSA issues and not addressing kind of what I would call the nuts and bolts Fair Labor Standards Act stuff during this time, but we may get some guidance for that. Next question, what if an exempt employee requests the FLSA child care leave? Are we able to pay the 2/3 as required by the Act? Yes. Okay, so the FLSA child care leave is available for both exempt and non-exempt employees. I have a team of exempt employees whose hours were reduced from 40 to 20. Employees disregarded this change and continued to work their 40 hours that week. They should be paid for the 40 hours they worked. Is that correct? Okay, I'm going to give you my favorite lawyer answer to that. It depends. When you say that you reduce their hours from 40 to 20, my answer depends on whether they retain their exempt status or not. It is possible to work 20 hours or have a schedule of 20 hours a week and be paid on a part-time basis, but still be exempt if you're still being paid enough, right? So if they're exempt still, then they do not have to be paid the extra time, because remember, exempt employees are paid the same salary no matter how much or how little they work in a week. If you change their exempt status to non-exempt and they worked 40 hours a week, then they do have to be paid for all 40 hours. Okay, I'm just going to take a few more because I want Keith to have a chance, and then we can get back to questions later. Can employers put exempt workers on work share? I believe that's the unemployment work share program that person is, the person asking the question is responding to. Yes, I believe they can. Okay, we are currently paying a hazard pay premium of $2 per hour for all hourly workers for regular hours worked only and not including it for overtime hours. Okay or not? You can pay an extra $2 per hour and add it to their wage rate for regular hours, but that does have to be included in the overtime premium. So, and I hate to do math in public, let alone live. Hopefully that was clear enough. Michael, you asked the question. You can reach out to me after the webinar if that wasn't clear. But let's just say their wage rate was $10 an hour and you're paying them a $2 an hour premium for hours under 40, then their rate becomes $12 an hour, and now their overtime rate is 1.512, which I believe is $18 an hour, whereas before it would have been 15. Someone else is asking for the link to the exception method. I can get you that as well. Are there any provisions in recent legislation for exempt employees who are at the minimum Fair Labor Standards Act salary threshold but will fall below it due to a temporary layoff related to COVID-19? So there's no legislation or regulations or guidance from the department on that, But if folks are laid off, meaning they're not actually working, technically they wouldn't really have an exempt or non-exempt status because they're not working at all. They're probably getting unemployment. And then when they come back to you, assuming they're making at least the minimum salary amount, they would retain their exempt status when they come back to you. Because remember, an important concept under the Fair Labor Standards Act is that the exemption, the minimum salary, and basically all payment is judged on a weekly basis, not pay period and not annual. So I think what the question gets at is their annual salary would now fall below the annualized minimum, right? Because they would be working for a full year. That is irrelevant to a Fair Labor Standards Act analysis. Okay, so what's relevant to the Fair Labor Standards Act is, did they get the minimum salary for that particular work week? So once they come back from layoff and they're working for you, as long as they make the minimum in each week they work for you, and it's not reduced for quantity or quality, they are entitled to keep their exempt status. Okay, with that, I will turn it over to my partner, Keith, and we will take questions after he's done with his material. Keith?
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. That was very helpful and a lot of great questions there. Before we get started, I want to just assure everyone that I do have pants on. And so at least for the beginning of my portion of this webinar, we're going to keep it clean. There might be an example later that we'll talk about maybe that isn't so clean, but it's truthful and it's what's happening out there. So some more alphabet soup, right? The issues to consider for everyone this morning, and that is the traditional labor law issues, the National Labor Relations Board, the National Labor Relations Act, FLSA, oh, fun Thursday mornings, right? We're going to talk a little bit this morning about the issues for non-union employers first, and then union employers second. And we'll spend a good portion of our time on the non-union employer piece because I think that majority of our clients, that applies to everyone, but we are certainly going to hit some of the key points on the unionized employers if you're dealing with labor unions. You saw this picture here on the first slide. This was actually posted in the Romulus Amazon warehouse when they staged their walkout. I mean, you guys have seen the news. You know what's going on here. Stand together for our rights. This is a real issue for lots of employers, in particular anyone who is essential and continuing to operate, and that you need your employment and your workforce to continue to do the great things that they do every day. So go ahead to the next slide, Rebecca. Okay. I found this interesting. The first issue I want to talk about is strikes or slowdowns, but there's a website out there that tracks all of the COVID-19 strikes, sit-downs, et cetera. And you can just look at that map. Look at all those marks. And if you go to this website, you can click on it, and they'll link to the news article about it. But look how many there are. I mean, in a normal year, we see very few strikes or slowdowns. In this epidemic, we are seeing, the pandemic, I should say, we are seeing tons and tons of work stoppages. And you can kind of see on the left, I mean, we've got Pittsburgh sanitation workers, nursing home care, Pilgrim Pride meat packers. We got Detroit bus drivers who went on strike. And you've all saw the Amazon warehouse in Staten Island, in Romulus, Michigan. There were walkouts in Chrysler facilities in Michigan. So this is a real deal. And it's very important to remember, wait a second, my employees are not unionized. They can't strike. Wrong, right? Remember that the National Labor Relations Act gives every group of employees the right to strike. Every employee can withhold their services from you in an effort to secure better wages, terms, or conditions of employment. In this case, mostly, hey, we don't think this is safe. And if that is what they're achieving and they're trying to change their working conditions, then they have a right to strike just like a unionized employee. So don't forget strikes, slowdowns. And it's not just a strike, right? There's one example where a restaurant was doing takeout orders, and all of the staff decided, you know what, we're going to sit in here and we're not going to leave this restaurant until you do these things that we think need to be fixed for social distancing, for cleaning, and we're not leaving this restaurant until you give us the supplies that we need to do that. Another form of work stoppage. And you may have read Detroit Medical Center, there was an emergency nurse sit-in back in late March, protesting some of the working conditions related to COVID-19. So this is real and this is happening. And I raise it here because I think it's critical that all of our clients and all the employers think about what is our reaction to this going to be. Of course, it's protected activity, so the action cannot be you're fired. Okay, that's unlawful. I suppose it could be if you wanted to send that message, but I'm telling you that would violate the National Labor Relations Act. You'd likely get a charge, an injunction to put that person back to work could even be on the table, and certainly damages would be in play. But how, and is that the message that anyone wants to send in these times? And the answer is typically no way. We wouldn't want to do that. So what are you going to do? How are you going to address a strike or slowdown if it happens in your workforce? Have you thought about it? And we're going to talk about later the communication pieces that are critical here. People need to feel engaged. They need to feel safe. Your workers are looking to you for leadership. Your employees are looking to you for leadership. And if you are communicating why you are working, here's exactly why we're essential under the executive order. Here's the federal FLSA guidance, right? Fancy acronym. And here are the bullet points if you guys want to see. How are you communicating that in a way that they understand and feel comfortable and want to come to work? That's a challenge. I don't have the answers. Next slide, please. Okay, so strikes of sit-downs. And then we have our other favorite animal for non-union employers in the traditional labor world, and that is concerted protected activity, right? So clearly a strike is concerted protected activity. There's other forms of it, right? And there's two components of this. It's generally when workers or employees get together or want to act on behalf of multiple employees to express concerns to improve their working conditions, okay? And there's two prongs, right? Concerted and protected. And what do we mean by concerted? Okay. This is what we mean. In, with, or on the authority of others, or in preparation of group action. So this doesn't have to be, I grab Rebecca, we come, we get on a call with you, a Zoom call, and we complain about the teleworking conditions. That's concerted activity because I grabbed Rebecca, my coworker, and we did it together. It could be something as simple as Rebecca and I have a social distancing happy hour on Friday night on our Zoom call, and we drink a couple beers or whatever she prefers, and we decide that Miller Johnson's teleworking policy is bullshit, and we're going to go express concerns. And then the next day I send an email to the leadership at Miller Johnson saying, I think, and on behalf of my coworkers, I think this policy is bullshit and you need to fix it. Well, that's concerted action. So, and if it's in anticipation or preparation of group action. So if I'm sending emails to lots of people trying to prepare to join my cause, to join the group cause, that's going to be concerted. So the bottom line here is it's pretty easy to fall within, I should say, the concerted prong. Okay, that's prong one. Prong two is protected. Well, what is protected? Yeah, it's group action, or was going to lead to group action, but for what reasons? And it has to be for mutual aid and protection. And what that really means is a nice quote from the NLRB is, are employees trying to improve their working conditions, their terms, or otherwise trying to improve their lot? If you can answer that question, yes, it's protected. Contrast that with, I don't like this because I need to go fishing. Right? Well, that's a personal gripe. I don't like this policy because I'm not getting my overtime. And I rely on that because I have to pay child support and all these bills that to pay for my bass boat or whatever, right? That's a personal gripe. I'm not doing it for the protection of others. But think about how easy it is in this context, right? Look at the picture in the slide. We need protection from the COVID-19. Please help. standing next to another coworker with a mask on. Of course that's protected. It's for mutual aid and protection. So don't forget that when employees engage in this stuff, it's protected, and we got to make sure that you're managing those risks when you're taking any action related to it. You can go ahead to the next slide, Rebecca. Okay. The third piece I want to talk about from a non-union perspective is some work rules. Okay, how are your work rules going to be applied in the COVID-19 context? And we have a very good decision from the National Labor Relations Board about a year and a half ago now called Boeing. And now we have three categories. The board will look at rules that are lawful to have in your handbook, to promulgate, to follow generally. Those are lawful because they are serving legitimate business interests, and their impact on any protected activity that we just discussed is very minimal. And those are just going to be lawful. The second category is a category of rule where, you know what, you have legitimate employer interests and reasons for that rule, but this is really impacting people's ability to engage in the concerted activity that we just talked about on the last slides. And so what the NLRB is going to do there is say, well, that rule is going to be lawful only if we do a balancing of those interests, and if the employer can show that your interests outweigh or the impact on the employee's rights is fairly minimal or limited in scope, then that rule is going to be found to be lawful as well. And then the third category is, look, you may have some employer interest here, but this is clearly a significant impediment or burden on an employee's protected conduct, and therefore that's going to be clearly unlawful, or if you're applying the rule just to protected activity and nothing else. And I think one of the things to remember when we're looking at your rules, or if an employee challenges a work rule, or you're thinking about a discipline in this COVID-19 world, is the difference between the work rule itself on its face and as applied. And these Boeing rules talk about, is it lawful to maintain a work rule? And you guys may remember, a lot of you may remember, that the old rule used to be a employer's rule or policy would be overbroad and unlawful if some employee might think that it infringes upon their protected activity. And the NLRB would engage in this ridiculous hypothetical analysis as to what a quote unquote reasonable employee might think. Well, that reasonable employee was never really reasonable. They were, you know, how can I manipulate this policy to apply to my protected activity, and it must be unlawful. That's on its face. And so if you survive that, great. That's a lawful policy to have. You still always have to remember, just because your rule is lawful, you could still apply it in a way that's discriminatory or violates the law, the National Labor Relations Act. For instance, you can have a lawful work rule against disparaging and malicious false statements against coworkers, okay? But if you only applied that to any disparaging false statements that were union related, well, that's a discrimination. Even though your work rule might survive scrutiny if it was applied consistently, you always have to look at how you're applying the rule. But you guys likely know that already. So let's talk a little bit about some of the social, I'm looking at my first bullet point, some of the policies that are in play here and that what we're seeing. And the biggest one is the social media policy. Many of you have these, and they are going to be in likely the second category of Boeing, which is you got to look at the employer interests, you got to look at the impact that they have on the employees' rights. And so let me give you a couple examples, samples. The first one is where this gets a little rated mature, I would say. If you've got a cell phone or you got another Internet Explorer or Google Chrome running somewhere, Google, if you haven't, the Romulus Amazon shutdown and a female adult sex toy. And you will find, guaranteed, you'll get in your top hits, you will get Jamel Anderson, Jamel Hill. She's used to be on ESPN, a commentator out of Detroit, Michigan State grad, for all you Spartans out there. She posted on Twitter a gentleman with a mask who worked at Amazon who was on strike, standing next to another worker on strike, complaining that Amazon was not essential. These working conditions were wrong. This is not essential. Sure, we can sell food, we can sell all these things, but not this adult sex toy. But not this adult sex toy. And so he posts that on his social media. Is that considered protected activity? Does it violate your social media policy? And if it does, are you going to take any disciplinary action? These are all things that you have to think about because they're happening. And what are you going to do when your employees post things? Do you have a protocol? Are you going to walk through that? Are you going to make sure that you protect your interests? I think in that case, that's high risk to take discipline there, even though they've connected the adult sex toy to Amazon. But the reality is they sell them on Amazon, and so that's not, so reckless or disloyal that it's going to lose protection under the Act. And I think that would be high risk to discipline them. Contrast with something like this. An employee decides to go on Facebook. We'll use Miller Johnson as a hypothetical. And they decide that, let's say our legal staff has to come in to make copies for hearings and stuff, and they don't think it's safe to work. So they come in, we make them come in to do copying and get the exhibits ready for the hearing, and they say this is unsafe. Well, they go home that night and they post on Facebook against, one of those, background screens, red flames, and then, they have text blocks on those. And on the text blocks, they say, if Miller Johnson were the Nazis and we were the Jews, we'd all be ashes. Think about that. What's Miller Johnson going to do there? I tell you what Miller Johnson is going to want to do. We're going to want to fire that person. And does that lose the protection of the Act? I think arguably it may, and especially if it's not liked by anyone else, right? If it's just one person saying that, you might have arguments. And I think and it's a nuanced discussion, and I'm not going to go through it all here on this call because I want to get through to these other issues. But I wanted to flag those things for you. If you have any doubt about those things, make sure you're reaching out to us, to whoever you work with normally, and so we can walk you through those things. And how are you going to handle that? One of the things you can do, and it's at the bottom here, is property rights IT systems. There's some great case law. I'm sorry, you can go back. There's some great case law that recently came out that gives you your rights to your email system back and your right to control IT system and to exclude all non-related business reasons, right? And now my example was, somebody on Facebook. Obviously, you can't control an individual's personal Facebook posts, but to the extent they're using your property, your IT systems, have you dusted those policies off? Have you looked at those? And I'll say this, there was a decision that came down April 2nd that basically said, look, if you open up your email or your posts or your IT systems to any number of things, including only positive employee comments, that was found to be lawful, and it didn't require you to permit negative employee comments just because they were protected or they related to union materials. So that's a great case. If you haven't dusted off your no solicitation, no distribution policies, your equipment policies, there's some good opportunities to do that. And you might want to do it now before your employees do something out there that you want to apply this policy. The other common questions I'm getting, speaking to the press. What if we have a rule that says you can't speak to the press? That rule is perfectly lawful if it says you can't speak to the press as a representative of X company, because you get to control your spokespeople, your spokesperson. So if they are doing something and it looks like they're wearing your uniform, they're wearing your logo, they're in your truck, they're in your van, whatever, if looks like they're doing that, you can have that rule in place. Now, if you have a rule that says you can't talk bad about us in the public, that's a Category 2 rule. And you're going to have to show what your business interest is for not allowing that to happen against the employee's ability to go into the public and speak out about their working conditions, because they have a right to do that. And those are a lot harder to defend. I will tell you the non-disparagement rules are much easier to defend when it's linked to not disparaging coworkers, the professional services that we offer. You know, it's got to be narrowly tailored. Those can be more defensible, but again, you're going to have some risk. So if you haven't looked at your rules, take a look at those and get them ready. And then how about no recording rules? There was a nurse in the Detroit that had whipped out her phone and videoed some of the precautions that they're taking for COVID-19 patients, and actually showing that and posted it on social media. Clear breach of confidentiality, clear breach of, a rule that said you can't film or record things. And those rules are Category 1 rules. So again, if that's something that applies, if you don't have that rule, you might want to think about it. If you do have that rule, that'll give you some comfort. And of course, civility rules can always be enforced as long as, we're talking about just inappropriate, harsh, obscene, that sort of, I know it when I see it, this is horrible conduct. Those types of civility rules are going to be enforced. Go ahead to the next slide, Rebecca. Thanks. Okay, and then the last thing I want to talk about for non-union employers, and I think everyone needs to think about this, if you're concerned or you want to stay or remain union-free, and every organization makes that decision for themselves. But if that's important to your organization, this is the time when, employee engagement is crucial. It is fertile ground for union organizing right now. I mean, look at this sign, money comes and goes, but health is irreplaceable. If you or your workers feel like you're not hearing them in this critical time, in this scary time, frankly, for many people, if you're not doing what is right, if you're not standing by them, that's the perfect opportunity for union organizers to slip in and start turning their heads, right? This is unsafe. We see it in the construction trades unions. I mean, they're telling everybody we can't work on job sites. I mean, they had to be shut down because it's unsafe. It's unsafe. And if that fear gets into your workforce and they don't feel like you're helping them, you're supporting them, that's when union organizing is going to start. And I can't stress enough that communications piece, that engagement piece, if you haven't thought about that, you haven't thought about how this might affect your union-free strategy or union organizing, you need to do that, and you need to talk with leadership about that and its impact. And you need to keep an eye out for early warning signs. I know a number of clients that I've talked to have said, yeah, we're getting grumblings, like maybe we need a union. So don't forget that piece. Okay, let's go on to unionized employers for a little bit. All right, so unionized employers, strikes. Wait a second, Keith. I'm a unionized employer. We have a collective bargaining agreement. It has a no strike clause. I'm better than my non-union counterparts, right? I got strike protection. These guys can't walk out on me. This is fantastic. It is really good because the no strike protection is great if you have it in your contract, and most do. And it will serve to prevent employees from walking out. And it certainly precludes the union from sponsoring or supporting a strike and potentially getting an injunction to stop the strike. But there are two caveats I would say to that. One is what we call a wildcat strike, which employees decide, you know what, we're going on strike and we don't care about the no strike clause. And we saw that there's a warehouse, grocery warehouse in Memphis recently that they just walked out. They had a collective bargaining agreement. It was a Teamsters warehouse. They said, this is unsafe. You guys need to do all this cleaning. You're not doing social distancing the correct way. We are out of here. Great. So what does that really mean? Well, one, it's a PR nightmare. Are you going to fire everybody? You can, because they're not protected. If you strike in violation of a no strike clause, the employees are not protected and you can fire them. But are you going to do that? Is that the headline you want in the Chicago Tribune and the Grand Rapids Press and the New York Times? Of course not. Of course not. So how are you going to deal with that? So it's still a reality. And the other caveat I would say is that if employees believe that the working conditions are quote unquote abnormally dangerous, there's a federal law that says that is not considered a strike. So if the employees can prove that their working conditions are abnormally dangerous, then that is not a strike under federal law and therefore not part of your no strike provision. So I just say that, and we can talk in depth if anyone has questions about this, about what is abnormally dangerous. It's a very high burden, but that's something to think about. All right, second bullet point for unionized employers, union relations communications. What's your union relationship like right now? Is it good? Is it bad? And how are you going to manage that? You know, can you improve it? Do we want to communicate with the union more during this time? If you got a great relationship, yeah, absolutely. You want to make sure that they're in on things, that you're working with them. You know, I'm not saying that they're going to call the shots. They shouldn't. But I think managing that relationship and thinking about that and making sure that they don't get blindsided is something that unionized employers need to think about, especially if you have a good working relationship. So communications are important with your union counterparts, both in terms of kind of, you know, making sure you get what you need and you want to operate. But frankly, I'll be honest with you, we've got clients that if this continues, they may have some economic tough roads ahead. And if you have 2 or 3 years left on your collective bargaining agreement, you might need that relationship. You might need to work with the union to negotiate concessions in the middle of a contract. So think about your strategies there. Okay, what about requests to bargain? What if a union wants to request to bargain over all these COVID-19 related reasons? Well, there's a couple of points you should keep in mind for if you're representing unionized firms. First is if you have a term in your contract, you know, if they want hazard pay, but it's not in your contract, well, the pay rate is set. There's no duty to bargain over changing existing contract terms. Okay, that's a permissive, non-mandatory subject of bargaining that you don't have to bargain about until the end of the contract. So you're allowed to bargain if you want. Both sides can do it voluntarily, but nothing requires you to. And then there's an excellent case that recently came out last winter called MV Transportation that basically says, look, if you have a management rights clause and it reserves broad rights to you to establish methods of providing services, policies, reasonable rules, those sorts of things, if your contract covers it and the union wants to bargain about it, they don't get to. There's no duty to bargain. So even though you may not have a provision in your contract that says we have the right to implement, you know, social distancing and all sorts of, you know, cleaning mitigation efforts for this pandemic, if you have the rights to generally do those things, there's no duty to bargain, which is great news. And of course, legal compliance. Check your contract to see if there's something that says if a new law gets passed, you have a discussion or you have some sort of notice obligation to the union. But at the end of the day, and almost every day with now over 50 executive orders in Michigan, you got to comply with the law. So make sure if you need to, you know, follow FFCRA, just give the union notice, hey, this is what we plan to do. We're complying with the law. We don't have an obligation to bargain, and they should understand that. All right, next slide, please, Rebecca. All right, and this is my last slide, and then I'll stop yakking and maybe see if I can answer any questions for you all. What about unilateral changes? What if we just need to make changes? We need to keep our people working, or we need to stand by these people and our workers here. Incentive pay, hazard pay, as Rebecca mentioned, benefit changes, additional PTO, whatever it is. If you make unilateral changes without the union's permission to your agreement, and it's not within your right to do it under your contract, that's going to be a violation of the National Labor Relations Act. But the penalty is minimal, right? Even if you did it, it's going to be don't do it again and undo the change if you have to. Now, if you make negative changes, I should clarify, if you make negative changes, those are going to be, that's going to expose you to financial risk. But if you're just talking about increases, there's really no financial damages. And in fact, it puts the union in a position where you're like, well, is the union really going to file a charge and ask to take away pay or benefits? So of course you want to communicate with the union about this, spin it as positive because it is. It's not spin, I guess, just advertise it as positive, get it done. And if the union is refusing for whatever reason because they're trying to get something else that you're not willing to give and you need to make that unilateral change, know that you can. It's got legal risk, but it's manageable. Information requests, that is tied to the duty to bargain. So if there's no duty to bargain, then technically there's probably not an information request duty, but it's more nuanced than that. You want to make sure that if you've implemented policies, if there's any information that's related to how that affects employees, that should all be given to the union. If it's something that is, what we call presumptively relevant, i.e. it bears upon terms or conditions and it's information, you should make sure you get it to them. Now, if it's confidential or proprietary, you can tell the union, hey, there's confidential, we need to talk about a agreement that you're not going to disclose this. We're willing to sit down and hammer that out with you. So if you get these information requests, if you have any questions about that, make sure you're reaching out before you just say no. And the last 2 points, the second to last point is grievances, contract liability. Don't forget, we're all going 100 miles an hour. We're all doing things quickly. Take a look at your contract. You don't want grievances or financial risk if you don't follow your contract. And this is particularly relevant if you're going through some layoffs, temporary, maybe permanent reductions in force. What does your contract say about that, right? Does it have to be by seniority? Do you have to give notice, okay? And they're bumping rights. All those things, make sure you don't forget about when you're flying through the COVID world. Last thing I want to talk about for unionized employers and really for this morning is your overall labor strategy. Okay, when life hands us lemons, what do we try to do? This is a tough spot for many, many employers. But are there things you want to change about your business that you've always wanted to change, but maybe the union has been resistant? Is this an opportunity to make those changes? Maybe you want to do less in-person work. Maybe you want to do, reductions and more automation in a way that, can minimize contact. I think you have a unique opportunity here in the sense that our world is changing and the public and people understand that if you want to change your scope and nature of your business to get there, it may be an opportunity to start marching and doing those things that you've always wanted to do. And so I encourage you to think about that on a, step back on a bigger picture. Are there things, that we can do here? Yeah, this stinks for us, but are there ways we can turn this negative COVID mess into something positive in terms of our union relationship and in terms of maybe any shackles or restrictions that we've viewed as the union standing in the way, which of course they have a right to do because they're the bargaining representative. But I think it sort of decreases their leverage if you're doing these things because the world is changing and because we need to be safe, and those are good opportunities. And part of that too is, what do you do in your negotiation strategy? If your contract's about to expire in October, do you want to roll it over for another year? Will the union agree? And maybe you do, right? Or maybe you don't. But those are things you need to be thinking about as you move forward. So with that, I'll be quiet for a little bit, and or maybe I won't be quiet, depending on if you guys have questions. But I'll finish my portion of the webinar, and we'll see if we got some questions.
Thanks, Keith. That was really helpful. Going back to the questions now, let's see if there's any labor questions. We are after 9 o'clock, so we'll just take one or two. And if we didn't get to your question, fullest apologies, please email Keith and I with your question, and we will answer it. There is our contact information and our real pictures, and you can jot down our contact information and email us your question if we don't get to it now. Okay, so the ones I'm seeing are more FLSA, so I'll answer again just a few and then let you all get on with your morning. Do you recommend that we do not use FMLA for the COVID-related absences? Okay, so FMLA is a right, so you are required to use FMLA if traditional FMLA I'm talking about, not the new FMLA, if the employee has a serious medical condition or if they cannot work to care for someone with a serious medical condition, then they are entitled to that FMLA. The expanded FMLA, my understanding of that is it expands what someone would normally be entitled to use FMLA for, right? Like for caring for children, for instance, that normally wouldn't qualify for FMLA, and now it does qualify for that expanded. But if they have a serious medical condition, whether it's because of COVID-19 or any other reason, then they get their the FMLA if they're otherwise entitled for it, right? Worked for you for enough time, that sort of thing. Next question, and I think the last. If we have a salary exempt employee that we laid off due to business downturn, the loans came in, I'm assuming that's the PPP loans that we helped most of you with, and lots of businesses in West Michigan. We asked them to come back to work midweek, Thursday and Friday. Can we pay them for just Thursday and Friday of that week? That's a great question, and one we looked into for other clients, more so when the layoff was taking effect midweek. So one of the exceptions to paying a full salary for any week in which an exempt employee works is the first and last week of their employment. So first and last week, if they're partial weeks, you do not have to pay for the full week. A layoff situation is not directly addressed in the regulations because it's not really that when they come back to work Thursday, Friday, it's not really their first week of work. They have maintained that employment relationship with you. The only reason they didn't work Monday through Wednesday is that the business didn't have enough work for them to do those days. And looking at it through that lens, they would be paid for the entire week. So the most practical advice there is have them come back on Monday, right, instead of Thursday or Friday. With that, Keith and I will sign off. We wish you as good of a day as can be expected, which is my typical, the typical way I close conversations these days. We never know what's coming each day, but we thank you for starting your morning with us. If we could not get to your question again, please email Keith or I, and we will email you back. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks.